No one in the courtroom was ready for what happened next. The tension was thick. Cameras were rolling. Lawyers were whispering. And when Pam Bondi stood her ground and pushed back against the court's direction, the judge leaned forward, paused, and delivered 7 words that froze the entire room. Those 7 words would echo far beyond the courtroom walls. Here's exactly what happened. It was supposed to be another routine legal proceeding, structured arguments, formal objections, and procedural back and forth. But when Pam Bondi rose to speak, it was clear this wasn't going to be ordinary. Courtrooms operate on rhythm. There's a predictable cadence to everything, the shuffle of papers, the steady tone of attorneys presenting motions, the judge occasionally interrupting to clarify a point. Most hearings move like clockwork. Even disagreements tend to follow a script. But this moment felt different. Bondi, known for her firm courtroom presence and sharp legal instincts, wasn't one to shy away from confrontation. Over the years, she had built her reputation handling high-stakes legal battles, often stepping into cases that carried political tension and public scrutiny. She understood pressure. In many ways, she thrived under it. On this particular day, the issue at hand centered around how certain evidence and procedural decisions were being handled. To some observers, it might have sounded technical, just another dispute about interpretation. But inside a courtroom, interpretation is everything. Bondi believed the court was moving in a direction that crossed a line. From her perspective, the interpretation being applied didn't just affect this case, it had the potential to create a precedent. And in law, precedent is powerful. Once a line is drawn, it can shape future rulings for years. As the opposing counsel wrapped up their argument, there was a sense that the matter was nearly settled. Their presentation had been polished, confident, and aligned with the direction the judge appeared to favor. A few subtle nods from the bench suggested agreement. Then Bondi stood. She didn't rush. She didn't sigh or show visible frustration. She simply rose, buttoned her jacket, and waited for acknowledgement. The room quieted almost instantly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. But her words were direct. "Your Honor," she began, her tone steady and deliberate, with respect, the interpretation being proposed here departs significantly from established standards. No theatrics. No emotional appeal. Just precision. She laid out her argument methodically, piece by piece. She cited prior rulings, cases where courts had drawn clear boundaries around similar procedural questions. She referenced long-standing principles meant to safeguard fairness in the legal process. Her point wasn't that the court lacked authority. Her point was that authority must be exercised carefully. As she spoke, her delivery remained calm, but her conviction was unmistakable. She argued that allowing the current interpretation to stand would risk undermining fundamental fairness, not only in this case, but in others that might follow. She paused briefly, letting her words settle. You could sense the shift in the room. Spectators who had been casually observing now leaned forward. The opposing counsel stopped jotting notes and looked up. Even the court reporter's steady typing seemed louder in the silence between her sentences. Bondi continued, carefully distinguishing the facts of the current matter from the broader legal standards at play. She emphasized that procedural safeguards exist for a reason, to prevent imbalance, to ensure due process, and to maintain public confidence in the system. At one point, she referenced how courts in previous decisions had rejected similar interpretations precisely because of the long-term risks involved. Her argument wasn't emotional. It was strategic. She wasn't attacking the court. She was challenging the reasoning. And that distinction mattered. There's a fine line in any courtroom between advocacy and defiance. Bondi walked it carefully. Every phrase was measured. Every citation intentional. She made it clear, respectfully but firmly, that she disagreed. The judge remained still, hands folded, expression neutral. No interruptions. No visible reaction. That silence made the moment heavier. Bondi concluded by reiterating that her objection wasn't about winning a procedural point. It was about protecting the integrity of the process itself. The court's role, she noted, is not only to decide, but to ensure that the framework guiding those decisions remains consistent and fair. When she finished, she didn't immediately sit down. She held her posture for a brief second, not as a challenge, but as emphasis. Then she returned to her seat. The air in the courtroom felt different now. What had started as routine had transformed into something far more significant. This was no longer just a technical disagreement. It was a test of legal philosophy, a debate about boundaries, discretion, and precedent. The opposing counsel shifted in their chair, clearly preparing to respond if invited. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances. The tension wasn't explosive, it was controlled, concentrated. You could feel the energy shift. In court, moments like these don't require raised voices or dramatic gestures. Sometimes, all it takes is a calm but unwavering challenge to authority. And that's exactly what had just happened. Courtrooms are usually controlled environments. There's a rhythm. A structure. An unspoken understanding of how things flow. Attorneys speak when recognized. Judges guide the discussion. Objections are raised, ruled upon, and everyone moves forward. Even disagreements tend to follow a predictable pattern. But when an attorney openly challenges the court's reasoning, especially in a high-profile setting, it creates a different kind of atmosphere. The air tightens. That's exactly what happened as Pam Bondi continued her argument. The judge listened without interruption. No expression. No visible reaction. His posture remained steady, hands lightly folded, eyes focused forward. For seasoned courtroom observers, that kind of stillness can mean anything: agreement, disagreement, or careful calculation. Bondi, however, didn't try to read into it. She stayed locked into her reasoning. She clarified that her position wasn't rooted in defiance. She wasn't challenging the authority of the bench. Instead, she framed her argument around responsibility, the responsibility to protect the integrity of the legal process itself. Her voice remained level, but there was a sharpened edge of urgency beneath it. Your Honor, she emphasized, the concern here is not simply about this ruling in isolation. It's about the framework it establishes. That word, framework, seemed to hang in the room. She explained that courts don't just resolve disputes, they set standards. Every interpretation carries weight beyond the immediate case. If certain procedural boundaries were relaxed now, future litigants might cite this very moment as justification for broader shifts. In law, small cracks can become structural changes. She warned that the path being considered could have long-term consequences, consequences that might not be fully visible today but would unfold over time. Her argument was forward-looking, almost cautionary. Across the aisle, the opposing counsel shifted uncomfortably. When Bondi referenced prior cases to support her warning, the opposing side finally stood. Objection, Your Honor, came the interruption, firm but controlled. The argument, they claimed, was speculative, moving beyond the immediate matter at hand. For a brief second, voices overlapped. Then the judge held up a single hand. Not forcefully. Not dramatically. Just enough. Silence. The interruption stopped mid-sentence. The courtroom, which had begun to stir with energy, went completely still. Even the faint sounds of shuffling papers stopped. The soft hum of the air system suddenly felt louder in contrast. Spectators leaned forward, sensing something significant. Reporters paused their typing, fingers hovering above keyboards. No one wanted to miss what came next. The judge didn't immediately speak. He simply looked toward Bondi, signaling she could continue. That subtle gesture carried weight. Bondi acknowledged the court with a nod and resumed, choosing her words even more carefully now. She avoided exaggeration. She avoided speculation. Instead, she anchored her point in principle. This is not about expanding the argument, she clarified. It is about ensuring consistency with established legal safeguards. Her tone wasn't defensive. It was deliberate. What had begun as a procedural disagreement was now clearly something deeper. It wasn't personal in the sense of hostility. There were no raised voices, no sharp exchanges. But it was personal in principle. This was about legal philosophy. About how far discretion should reach. About where interpretation ends and overreach begins. Bondi took one final step in her argument, reinforcing that the judiciary's role is not only to interpret the law but to preserve trust in its fairness. Public confidence, she implied, depends on courts applying standards consistently, not bending them, even subtly. Then she delivered her closing line, calm, precise, unmistakable. The court has a responsibility to uphold both the letter and the spirit of the law. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The statement served as both conclusion and challenge, not to authority, but to conscience. And with that, she sat down. She didn't shuffle her papers immediately. She didn't glance toward the gallery. She kept her focus forward, posture composed. The opposing counsel remained standing for a brief moment, as if considering whether to add something further. But the judge's attention had already shifted. All eyes turned to the bench. The weight of the room settled there. This was the pivot point, the moment when advocacy gives way to authority. Attorneys argue. Judges decide. The stillness felt almost cinematic. You could sense the anticipation spreading through the gallery. Observers weren't just waiting for a ruling, they were waiting to see how the court would respond to such a direct yet respectful pushback. The judge leaned slightly forward. A subtle movement, but in that environment, it felt amplified. What had started as routine was now anything but. The exchange had elevated the stakes. This wasn't simply about a procedural ruling anymore. It was about precedent. Principle. Power balanced by restraint. And in that suspended moment, before the judge spoke, everyone understood they were witnessing something that would be remembered, not for drama, but for its clarity. Because sometimes the most powerful moments in a courtroom are not defined by shouting or spectacle. They're defined by silence. And right now, that silence was absolute. The judge adjusted his glasses. It was a small movement, almost routine, but in that moment, it felt amplified. Every subtle gesture carried weight. Every shift in posture seemed deliberate. He looked directly at Pam Bondi. Not past her. Not down at his notes. At her. There was a long pause, the kind that stretches time. In reality, it may have only been a few seconds. But inside that courtroom, it felt suspended. No one moved. No one whispered. Even breathing seemed quieter. Bondi remained still at counsel's table, her posture straight, hands resting calmly in front of her. She didn't fidget. She didn't look away. She waited. And then he spoke. "Counselor, the court will not waver." 7 words. That was it. No elaboration. No extended reasoning. No dramatic tone. Just 7 measured words delivered evenly, almost clinically. But their impact was immediate. The reaction wasn't loud. There were no audible gasps, no visible outbursts. Courtrooms don't allow for that kind of display. But you could feel the shift, like a current running through the room. A few spectators exchanged glances. One reporter slowly exhaled and resumed typing. The opposing counsel straightened slightly in their chair, sensing the reinforcement of the court's direction. The statement wasn't emotional. It wasn't aggressive. The judge hadn't raised his voice or shown irritation. It was something else. It was final. In those 7 words, the judge did 2 things at once. First, he acknowledged that Bondi's challenge had been heard. The pause before he spoke made that clear. He hadn't dismissed her argument casually. He had considered it. Second, he drew a line. The court will not waver. That phrasing mattered. He didn't say, I disagree. He didn't say, your objection is overruled, though that was the practical effect. He chose language that conveyed steadiness, immovability. It wasn't just a ruling. It was a declaration of resolve. For a split second, the air felt heavier. This wasn't just a procedural disagreement anymore. It had transformed into something symbolic, a defining moment of authority versus advocacy. On one side stood Bondi, representing the role of counsel, to question, to challenge, to test the boundaries of interpretation. Her job was to push. On the other side sat the bench, embodying judicial authority, the responsibility to decide, to interpret, and ultimately to stand firm when convinced of the correctness of a ruling. Neither role is superior to the other in purpose. They are designed to balance each other. But in this moment, the balance tipped decisively toward the bench. The judge's tone carried no hostility, but it carried certainty. It suggested that further debate on this particular issue would not change the outcome. The path had been chosen. Bondi absorbed the words without visible reaction. No sigh. No visible frustration. If anything, her expression tightened only slightly, the subtle acknowledgement of a seasoned attorney recognizing that the argument had reached its limit at this level. Around the room, observers processed what had just happened. For those unfamiliar with courtroom dynamics, the exchange might have seemed understated. After all, no one shouted. No gavel slammed dramatically. But legal professionals know that brevity can be powerful. Long explanations can leave room for interpretation. 7 direct words leave very little. The judge's statement sent a clear signal not only to Bondi, but to everyone present. The court's authority had been tested, and it had responded with composure and firmness. There would be no wavering. And yet, beneath that firmness was something else, respect. The judge had allowed Bondi to speak at length. He had listened without interruption. He had given space for her reasoning to unfold fully. Then, after consideration, he made his position unmistakably clear. That process, argument, pause, decision, is the heartbeat of the judicial system. Still, moments like this linger. Because they capture the essence of courtroom tension, the push and pull between interpretation and final judgment. Bondi had pushed hard, but strategically. The judge had responded calmly, but decisively. The silence that followed those 7 words was almost as powerful as the statement itself. No one rushed to speak. No one immediately moved to the next issue. For a brief moment, the gravity of the exchange settled over the courtroom. It was a reminder that law is not just about statutes and citations. It's about judgment calls. About discretion. About where lines are drawn and who has the authority to draw them. In that instant, the message was unmistakable. The debate had ended, at least for now. The court would not waver. And everyone in the room knew they had just witnessed a moment that would be remembered, not because of theatrics, but because of its clarity. 7 words. Measured. Controlled. Final. Here's where things got even more interesting. After the judge's firm declaration, "Counselor, the court will not waver," many in the room thought the moment had reached its peak. In high-pressure courtroom exchanges, there are usually 2 predictable reactions. An attorney either retreats quietly, accepting the ruling without another word, or pushes further, risking tension with the bench. A few spectators even shifted in their seats, expecting a flash of frustration or a final attempt to argue the point. But Pam Bondi did neither. Instead, she slowly stood again. There was no rush in her movement. No visible irritation. She buttoned her jacket calmly, the same way she had earlier. Then she gave a small, respectful nod toward the bench, not submissive, not confrontational, simply professional. And then she spoke. "Your Honor, we respectfully preserve our objection for the record." To the average observer, that sentence might sound procedural, even anticlimactic. No fireworks. No dramatic comeback. But inside a courtroom, those words carry enormous weight. Preserving an objection for the record is a strategic move. It signals that while the attorney accepts the court's ruling for the purposes of moving forward, they formally disagree with it. More importantly, it ensures that the issue remains alive for potential appellate review. In other words, the battle may be over in this courtroom, but it may not be over entirely. That's the part casual observers often miss. Courtroom battles aren't always about winning in the moment. They're not always about dramatic reversals or emotional declarations. Sometimes, they're about laying bricks, one by one, building a foundation for what might come next. Bondi understood that. By preserving her objection, she accomplished several things at once. First, she acknowledged the authority of the court. She did not defy the ruling. She did not create unnecessary friction. That maintains credibility, something every seasoned attorney protects carefully. Second, she safeguarded her client's options. Appellate courts review records. If an objection isn't clearly stated at the time of the ruling, it can be considered waived later. That single sentence ensured the issue would be documented and reviewable. Third, she demonstrated composure under pressure. Moments like that test more than legal knowledge. They test temperament. When the judge declared that the court would not waver, the spotlight shifted squarely onto her. Every camera, every spectator, every opposing attorney was watching to see how she would react. Would she show frustration? Would she press harder? Would she appear shaken? Instead, she adapted. That's what stunned many watching. There was strength in that restraint. A quieter kind of authority. Her calm composure signaled experience, the kind that comes from years of navigating complex legal battles. She knew that arguing further in that moment would likely achieve nothing. Worse, it could erode the professionalism she had maintained throughout the exchange. So she pivoted. And pivoting in a courtroom is not weakness. It's strategy. There's an old understanding among trial lawyers: you don't argue with the ruling once it's made. You make your record, and you move forward. The courtroom is not the place to win every disagreement. Sometimes, it's the place to prepare for a different arena entirely. As she sat back down, her posture remained composed. She gathered her notes without haste. The message was subtle but clear: the case would continue, and she would continue advocating within the boundaries set by the court. Across the aisle, the opposing counsel seemed momentarily uncertain. The tension they may have expected to escalate simply dissolved into professionalism. Even the judge's expression softened slightly, not in concession, but perhaps in acknowledgement of the disciplined response. Because strength in a courtroom isn't just about pushing back. It's about knowing when to push, and when to pivot. It's about understanding that advocacy has layers. There's the argument made out loud, and then there's the strategy unfolding quietly beneath it. In that moment, Bondi showed both. She had challenged the reasoning directly and respectfully. She had absorbed a firm rejection. And then she had repositioned, not retreating, but recalibrating. To many watching, that may have been the most impressive part of the entire exchange. Not the bold challenge. Not the judge's 7-word response. But the measured, disciplined follow-through. Because in high-stakes legal battles, composure is currency. And on that day, Bondi demonstrated that true courtroom strength isn't about dominating the moment. It's about mastering it. So why did those 7 words resonate so strongly? Because they represented something bigger than a single case. When the judge said, "Counselor, the court will not waver," it wasn't just a response to Pam Bondi. It was a reaffirmation of how the courtroom is designed to function. It was a reminder that the legal system operates on a carefully constructed balance, one that depends on clearly defined roles. Inside every courtroom, there's an invisible structure at work. Judges interpret and rule. Attorneys challenge and advocate. That tension isn't accidental. It's built into the justice system on purpose. Without attorneys pushing arguments to their limits, courts wouldn't fully test the strength of legal reasoning. Without judges drawing firm boundaries, proceedings would descend into disorder. This exchange captured that balance in its purest form. Bondi pushed back to defend her interpretation of the law. She raised concerns about precedent, fairness, and long-term implications. She did exactly what an advocate is meant to do: question, challenge, and protect her position. The judge responded to affirm the court's authority. After listening, pausing, and considering, he made it clear that the ruling would stand. Neither backed down from their roles. And that's the key takeaway. In a world where public debates often spiral into chaos, where disagreements turn personal and volume replaces reasoning, this moment showed something different. It showed that firm disagreement doesn't have to mean hostility. It demonstrated that opposing views can clash sharply while still staying within the structure of respect and procedure. The judge's 7 words weren't theatrical. They weren't delivered with anger or dramatic flair. There was no raised voice, no emotional commentary. They were measured. Intentional. Controlled. That restraint is what gave them power. When authority is exercised calmly, it sends a stronger message than if it's exercised loudly. The brevity of the statement made it unmistakable. It closed the debate without escalating it. And Bondi's reaction mirrored that same discipline. Her response wasn't explosive. She didn't attempt to reignite the argument or express visible frustration. Instead, she preserved her objection for the record, a quiet but powerful move that demonstrated long-term thinking. That strategy. To the untrained eye, it may have seemed like the moment ended with the judge's ruling. But to those familiar with courtroom dynamics, the real story was in what followed: the pivot, the recalibration, the understanding that today's loss could become tomorrow's appeal. That layered complexity is why the moment stuck with everyone watching. It wasn't about who won the exchange. It was about how it was handled. Every word spoken in a courtroom carries weight because it becomes part of the official record. Words shape outcomes. They create precedent. They influence future decisions. That's why precision matters. That's why tone matters. And in this exchange, both sides demonstrated that awareness. Sometimes, the most powerful moments aren't loud. They're controlled. They're precise. They unfold in silence and subtlety rather than spectacle. There's something almost paradoxical about it. In an era dominated by viral clips, heated arguments, and headline-grabbing sound bites, this moment gained attention precisely because it avoided all of that. It showed the system working as designed, tension contained within structure. Authority was asserted without aggression. Advocacy was expressed without disrespect. That's rare in today's public discourse. And maybe that's why it resonated beyond the courtroom walls. It served as a reminder that strength doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes strength looks like stillness. Like measured words. Like knowing exactly when to speak, and when to stop. For viewers, it became more than just a legal exchange. It became a lesson in composure. A demonstration of institutional boundaries. A snapshot of how disagreement can exist without disorder. In the end, those 7 words will likely be remembered not for their volume, but for their clarity. Because in the courtroom, unlike many other arenas, clarity is power. Every phrase is recorded. Every ruling documented. Every objection preserved. And in that environment, precision isn't optional. It's essential. If you enjoyed this breakdown of high-stakes courtroom dynamics and powerful legal moments, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story.